Sometimes, the smallest gestures can set in motion events that change lives forever. Lydia Carter, a curious and compassionate young girl, notices a lonely boy named Ethan Walker sitting quietly on a forgotten street corner. His worn clothes and distant gaze make him nearly invisible to the world, but not to Lydia, planting a seed that will grow in ways neither of them could have imagined. But life has a way of pulling people apart. One day, Ethan disappears without a trace, leaving Lydia with questions she can't answer and a hollow ache she can't quite explain. As the years pass, Lydia grows into a determined journalist, dedicating herself to telling the stories of those society overlooks. Yet deep down, she carries the memory of that quiet boy on the corner, always wondering what became of him. When Lydia's path unexpectedly crosses with a man who has devoted his life to helping others, she begins to unravel a story of resilience, unexpected kindness, and second chances. What happened to Ethan after he vanished? How did a small act of compassion shape his life? And what happens when two lives separated by time and circumstance are brought together once again? It was a summer afternoon, the kind where the heat hung thick in the air and the street seemed to shimmer under the weight of it. 7-year-old Lydia Carter kicked a small rock with her worn sneakers as she walked down the narrow road toward her house. The chirping of cicadas buzzed in her ears, mixing with the sound of distant cars and neighbors watering their lawns. Her backpack sagged against her small shoulders, full of school books she barely paid attention to. Lydia's head was always filled with stories, dreams, and questions no one seemed to have time to answer. She lived in a quiet neighborhood where every house looked the same: 2 stories, white picket fences, and flower beds that burst with bright colors. To anyone else, it might have seemed perfect. But for Lydia, life often felt lonely. Her parents worked long hours, her older siblings had their own friends, and her days after school were spent quietly reading or wandering the neighborhood. So, when Lydia first noticed the boy sitting on the corner of Maple Street, it was like spotting something out of place in a perfectly painted picture. The boy sat on the cracked sidewalk near the stop sign, his knees pulled up to his chest. His clothes were rumpled and worn, his shirt too big, his shoes scuffed and dirty. His dark hair hung in front of his face, almost hiding his downcast eyes. Lydia slowed her steps. People passed by, adults carrying groceries, teenagers on bikes, but no one looked at the boy. It was as though he were invisible. Lydia's heart thumped in her chest. She didn't know why, but something about the boy's stillness made her want to do something, anything. Clutching the sandwich her mom had packed that morning but that she had not eaten, Lydia hesitated. She glanced back at her house down the road, then turned toward the boy. She did not know where the courage came from, but her feet moved before she could think. "Hi," she said softly, standing a few feet from him. The boy looked up, startled. His eyes were brown, deep and distant, like a heavy secret lived behind them. Lydia noticed he was holding a small stick, tracing shapes in the dirt beside him. "Do you want this?" she asked, holding out her sandwich. It was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich wrapped in crumpled plastic. The boy's gaze flicked to the sandwich, then back to Lydia. He looked as though he might speak, but changed his mind. After a long pause, he finally reached out and took it. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice soft and scratchy. "You are welcome." Lydia smiled, feeling an odd warmth in her chest. "What is your name?" The boy hesitated again before answering. "Ethan. Ethan Walker." "I am Lydia," she replied brightly. "Do you live around here?" Ethan shook his head, looking back down at the sidewalk. He unwrapped the sandwich and took a careful bite. Lydia stayed where she was, watching him. She could tell he was uncomfortable, but he also did not tell her to leave. "Why are you sitting here?" she asked, not in a rude way, just curious. Ethan's shoulders shifted, as if he was trying to disappear into himself. "I do not know," he said finally. "I am just here." Something in his answer made Lydia's heart ache, though she could not understand why. She looked at him a moment longer before turning toward her house. "Okay," she said, as though this simple conversation was enough. "Maybe I will see you tomorrow." Ethan did not answer, but Lydia thought she saw something change in his expression, a flicker of surprise, maybe even hope, as she walked away. That night, Lydia lay in her small room, staring at the ceiling. The light from the street lamp outside cast strange shadows on her walls. She thought about Ethan, his quiet voice, the way he sat so still as the world moved around him. "Who is he?" she whispered to herself. She had never seen a boy like him before, someone who looked like he belonged to nowhere. Her parents had always told her to be careful around strangers, but something about Ethan was different. He was just a kid, like her, alone and quiet. The next day after school, Lydia packed an extra apple and a small toy. She had outgrown a plastic car with wheels that still spun. She told no one what she was doing, afraid they might stop her. When she walked toward the corner, Ethan was there again, sitting in the same spot. Lydia felt a small spark of happiness as she approached him. "Hi, Ethan," she said, crouching down beside him. Ethan looked up, startled again, but this time there was recognition in his eyes. "Hi. I brought you this," Lydia said, handing him the apple and the small car. Ethan stared at the items as though unsure what to do. He took the apple carefully, but his fingers lingered on the toy car. "It is yours," Lydia said. "You can keep it." Ethan turned the car over in his hands, watching the wheels spin. A small, almost invisible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was the first time Lydia saw him smile, and it made her feel like she had discovered something special. "Thank you," he said again, his voice stronger this time. "You are welcome," Lydia replied, sitting cross-legged beside him. She felt no need to talk. Instead, they sat together in silence, watching the cars pass and the leaves flutter in the breeze. This became Lydia's new routine. Every afternoon, she would stop by the corner with something small, a piece of fruit, a slice of cake her mom had baked, or a book of pictures she thought Ethan might like. Each day, Ethan seemed a little less distant. He spoke more, telling her his favorite color, blue, how he liked the sound of the wind, and how he wished he could live in a house with a garden someday. Lydia listened, her curiosity blooming with every word. "Do you think you will have a garden one day?" she asked him one afternoon as he held a piece of bread she had given him. Ethan shrugged, looking at the ground. "Maybe, but I do not think so." "Why not?" "Because things do not happen that way for people like me." Lydia frowned. "You are stronger than you think, Ethan. I know you can do it." Ethan looked at her then, his brown eyes searching hers, as though testing her sincerity. Lydia stared back, her expression firm. She did not know why, but she believed it. Ethan was strong, stronger than he realized. That day, Ethan's small smile returned, and Lydia carried it with her all the way home. Weeks passed, and their friendship grew. Lydia found herself looking forward to the afternoons with Ethan more than anything else. He became her friend, her only friend. But one gray afternoon, everything changed. Lydia arrived at the corner with a small slice of chocolate cake in her bag. The wind was cold, and dark clouds gathered overhead. She hurried to the stop sign, but when she got there, the corner was empty. Ethan was gone. Lydia's heart dropped. She looked around, hoping he was nearby, but there was no sign of him. She sat down on the cracked sidewalk, holding the small bag of cake in her lap. "Maybe he is coming," she whispered to herself. But Ethan never came. The next day, and the day after that, Lydia returned to the corner. Each time, her hope dimmed a little more. The space where Ethan had sat now felt empty and cold. "Where are you?" she whispered one afternoon, her voice small against the wind. Lydia did not know how to explain it, but she felt as though something precious had been taken from her. The boy who had once sat on the corner, the boy with quiet eyes and small smiles, was gone. At home, she tried to hide her sadness, but Mrs. Harris, her neighbor, noticed. "Are you all right, Lydia?" Mrs. Harris asked one evening, offering her a plate of cookies. Lydia shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "I just lost something." Mrs. Harris sat beside her, smiling gently. "Sometimes we do not understand why people leave our lives, but the kindness we give them does not disappear. It stays with them, wherever they go." Lydia looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Do you think Ethan will be okay?" Mrs. Harris squeezed her hand. "I think kindness has a way of helping people in ways we cannot see. You just have to believe it." Lydia nodded, though the ache in her heart remained. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought of Ethan, his dreams of a garden, his shy smile, and the boy he had been. Though he was gone, Lydia held on to the hope that wherever he was, the kindness she had shown him would still matter. And somehow she believed it would. The next day, Lydia Carter woke up with a tight feeling in her chest. She had dreamed of the corner on Maple Street, of Ethan sitting there with the small toy car she had given him. In her dream, he had smiled at her, a warm, bright smile, unlike any she had seen before. But as she tried to reach him, the wind carried him away like a shadow. Now, as she sat at the breakfast table, she could not shake the emptiness. Her mother bustled around the kitchen, pouring coffee for her dad and calling to her siblings to hurry up for school. Lydia picked at her toast, barely listening. "Are you feeling okay, honey?" her mom asked when she noticed Lydia's silence. "I'm fine," Lydia mumbled, though her voice betrayed the truth. She wasn't fine. Every part of her wanted to run to the corner again. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe Ethan would be there today, sitting as he always did. Maybe he had just been sick or scared to come out in the rain. By the time the school bus dropped her off in the afternoon, Lydia's feet carried her straight to Maple Street. She ran, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, as if hurrying might change what she already feared. The corner was empty again. Lydia slowed to a stop, her breath uneven from running. She looked at the cracked sidewalk, the spot where Ethan always sat. It was just a quiet piece of pavement now. The wind whistled through the trees, and the stop sign creaked on its post. A chill ran through her, even though the sun still hung in the sky. "Ethan," she whispered, as if saying his name might bring him back. But there was no answer. Her hands tightened around the straps of her backpack, and for the first time in a long while, Lydia felt a loneliness she could not explain. The days passed like this, each one heavier than the last. After school, Lydia would walk to the corner and sit quietly on the sidewalk, watching and waiting. She always brought something with her, a small snack, a book, or a picture she had drawn. She left them by the stop sign, hoping Ethan would come back and find them. But every day, the corner remained empty. Her parents began to notice the change in her. Lydia, who had always been full of questions and bright observations, now came home quiet and distracted. She spent more time alone, sitting in her room or on the porch, staring at the street. One evening, as Lydia sat outside, her neighbor Mrs. Harris appeared, carrying a tray of warm cookies. Mrs. Harris lived 2 doors down and was a kind older woman who always seemed to know when something was wrong. "Lydia, sweetheart," she said softly, setting the tray on the porch railing. "Come sit with me." Lydia hesitated, but climbed down from the steps and joined Mrs. Harris on the porch swing. The two sat in silence for a moment, the swing creaking as it swayed back and forth. "I've seen you walking to Maple Street every day," Mrs. Harris said gently. "Are you looking for someone?" Lydia looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a boy. He used to sit there. I think something happened to him." Mrs. Harris nodded thoughtfully. "And this boy, was he your friend?" Lydia blinked back tears. "I think so. I brought him food, and we talked. He didn't have anyone else, I think. And now he's just Gone. The words caught in Lydia's throat, and Mrs. Harris placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Sometimes people come into our lives when they need us most, Mrs. Harris said quietly. And sometimes they have to leave again, even if we don't understand why. But what if he's not okay? Lydia asked, her voice trembling. What if he's lost, or hurt, or… Mrs. Harris squeezed Lydia's shoulder gently. Kindness has a way of following people, Lydia. Maybe your friendship gave him the strength to move forward, to find something better. You may not see it now, but you made a difference. Lydia wiped her eyes and looked up at Mrs. Harris. Do you really think so? Mrs. Harris smiled warmly. I know so. You see, kindness is like planting seeds. You might not always see them grow, but they take root in ways you can't imagine. That night, Lydia thought about Mrs. Harris's words as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She remembered the way Ethan had smiled the first time she handed him a sandwich, how his fingers had lingered over the small toy car she had given him. She thought of his quiet voice, the way he had said, I want my own house someday. Lydia's heart ached, but there was something else there too, a small flicker of hope. Maybe Mrs. Harris was right. Maybe her kindness had been enough to help Ethan, even if she could not see it. Still, the ache in her chest lingered. The days turned into weeks, and eventually Lydia stopped walking to the corner. She still thought of Ethan often, his worn clothes, his distant gaze, and the quiet sadness that had surrounded him like a shadow. But with each passing day, the memory of him became softer, like a photo faded by time. Lydia threw herself into her books, her dreams, and her curiosity. She began reading stories about people who made a difference, writers, doctors, teachers, and volunteers. She learned how one small act could change a life, and as she grew older, she held on to that truth. Even so, some days, when Lydia passed Maple Street, she would glance toward the corner. It was always empty, but she still found herself hoping just a little that Ethan might be there again, waiting with his shy smile and quiet words. Years passed, and Lydia grew up. By the time she was 18, she had transformed into a determined young woman with an insatiable desire to uncover the truth and help those who needed it most. Her teachers often said she asked too many questions. She wrote essays about unfairness and injustice that made some people uncomfortable. But Lydia did not mind. She believed that stories could change the world. When it came time to choose a career, Lydia decided she wanted to be a journalist. She did not want to write about celebrities or gossip. She wanted to tell the stories of people no one else seemed to see. On the day she packed her bags to leave for college, Mrs. Harris came by to say goodbye. The older woman hugged her tightly, smiling with pride. You have always had such a big heart, Lydia, Mrs. Harris said. I hope you carry it with you wherever you go. I will, Lydia promised. Thank you for everything. Mrs. Harris patted her hand. Remember, kindness matters, even when you cannot see the result. Lydia nodded, those words taking root deep inside her. As she climbed into the car with her parents, she glanced one last time at Maple Street and the quiet corner where she had met Ethan Walker so many years ago. It was still empty, but this time, Lydia did not feel sad. Instead, she carried the memory of Ethan with her, the boy who had taught her that kindness, even in its smallest form, could mean everything. As the car pulled away, Lydia looked out the window and whispered softly, Goodbye, Ethan. I hope you are okay. And for the first time in a long while, she believed he was. The years that followed were a blur of hard work, late nights, and relentless curiosity. By the time Lydia Carter was 24, she had become a journalist, just as she had promised herself. Her early articles had been small, covering local events and neighborhood fundraisers, but her heart was always drawn to something deeper. Lydia had carried Ethan Walker's memory with her, like a quiet ember. Though time had dulled its sharp edges, the boy on the corner remained a part of her, a symbol of all the stories left untold, all the people, the world overlooked. It was this ache, this sense of unfinished business, that pushed Lydia to write about those who could not speak for themselves. Over the years, her voice grew louder as her articles began to uncover the hidden struggles of society. The city buzzed with noise as Lydia sat in a cramped corner of a bustling newsroom. Her desk was buried under notebooks, stray papers, and a half-empty cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The sound of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and her editor barking orders filled the air like static. "Carter!" a voice boomed from across the room. Lydia looked up to see her editor, Mr. Wallace, waving a piece of paper in the air. He was a stout, gruff man whose words carried more weight than his towering frame. "Here," he said, slapping the paper onto her desk. "There's been a report about kids sleeping near the old train station. Go check it out. And for God's sake, don't come back with a sob story. Make it tight. Make it sharp." Lydia nodded, ignoring the disapproving tone in his voice. Mr. Wallace didn't understand why she chose to focus on stories like these, stories that felt too heavy, as he often put it. But Lydia knew these stories mattered. If she did not tell them, who would? She grabbed her notebook, recorder, and jacket before heading out into the city streets. The sun was already sinking low in the sky, painting everything in muted shades of gold and gray. The area near the old train station was run down and forgotten, much like the people who gathered there. Crumbling brick walls, graffiti-streaked buildings, and weeds growing through cracks in the pavement gave it a hollow, abandoned look. Lydia's footsteps echoed as she walked through the empty lot, clutching her notebook to her chest. She spotted them, then a small group of children huddled beneath the remains of an old overhang. They sat close together, their clothes worn and thin against the growing chill in the air. Lydia's heart sank as she approached, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Hi," she called out softly, crouching a few feet away so as not to scare them. The children turned to look at her. A girl with messy blonde hair, no older than 10, stared at Lydia with wary eyes. A boy, a little younger, clutched a tattered blanket. "It's okay," Lydia said gently, holding up her hands. "I'm not here to bother you. My name is Lydia. I just want to talk." The blonde girl spoke first, her voice sharp and defensive. "What do you want?" "I want to hear your story," Lydia replied. "I write for a newspaper. I want people to know what you're going through." The girl snorted softly. "People don't care about us." Lydia's heart ached, but she remained steady. "Some do. I do." The girl studied Lydia for a moment, her distrust warring with the possibility of hope. Finally, she sighed. "What do you want to know?" Lydia sat cross-legged on the cold ground, notebook open. "What's your name?" "Amber." "And how long have you been here?" Amber shrugged. "A few weeks, maybe. We used to stay at a shelter, but they ran out of room. Me and my brother, Toby, we come here now." Lydia glanced at the boy beside Amber, Toby, who was clutching the blanket like it was the only thing keeping him together. He didn't look up, but his small shoulders shook with silent shivers. "Where are your parents?" Lydia asked softly. Amber's jaw tightened. "Gone." She didn't elaborate, and Lydia didn't press. The conversation continued, and Lydia learned how Amber and Toby had been moving from one place to another for as long as Amber could remember. Amber spoke matter-of-factly, as though she had long grown used to a world that refused to make space for her. "We take care of each other," Amber said, pulling Toby closer to her side. "That's what matters." Lydia scribbled furiously in her notebook, her mind already forming the shape of the story. But as she looked up at Amber and Toby, her thoughts shifted. It wasn't just a story to her. It never had been. She reached into her bag and pulled out 2 granola bars she had stashed earlier. "Here," she said, holding them out. "It's not much, but—" Amber snatched them quickly, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she muttered, breaking off a piece to hand to Toby. Lydia watched them eat, her chest heavy. She saw herself in Amber, the quiet strength, the protective instinct. And she saw Ethan in Toby, the same distant gaze, the same small frame swallowed up by a world too big and harsh for someone so young. When Lydia left the train station that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been here before, that she had met these children before, only under different names and faces. Back at the newsroom, Lydia sat at her desk, typing well into the night. Her words spilled out with purpose, each sentence a lifeline to the children the world had forgotten. The next morning, Lydia's article appeared on the front page of the city section. The headline read, "Invisible in Plain Sight, the Children of the Train Station." Her editor, Mr. Wallace, slapped the paper down on her desk with a gruff nod. "Good work, Carter. People are talking about it." Lydia glanced at the paper, her name printed neatly below the headline. But all she could think about was Amber and Toby, still sitting under that overhang. The article sparked a small wave of attention. Donations poured in for local shelters, and a group of volunteers visited the old train station to offer help. Lydia went back later that week and found Amber and Toby gone. A shelter worker told her they had been taken in and were now safe. Lydia felt a wave of relief, but also something deeper, a quiet sense that she was doing what she was meant to do. That night, as Lydia sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, she thought of Ethan again. The memory of the boy on the corner came to her with sharp clarity. "Do you think I can make it?" he had asked her once, holding a piece of bread. "Of course," Lydia had replied. "You're stronger than you think." She had believed it then, and she believed it now. Ethan's story had never ended. It had simply become a part of her, pushing her forward. Lydia pulled out an old notebook from the drawer in her desk, the one where she had written about Ethan all those years ago. The pages were yellowed with age. The pencil marks faded, but the words were still clear. "I hope you made it, Ethan," she whispered, her voice soft against the quiet of the room. And as she sat there, her mind filled with memories and dreams, Lydia promised herself that she would keep telling these stories. She would keep planting seeds of kindness, even if she never saw them grow, because she knew now kindness mattered. And sometimes it was the only thing that did. It had been 2 weeks since Lydia Carter's article about Amber and Toby made headlines. The piece had drawn praise from readers and stirred conversations in the newsroom. Lydia's editor, Mr. Wallace, had even begrudgingly admitted, "You know how to dig deep, Carter." Yet the compliment rang hollow. Praise didn't change the reality of children like Amber and Toby who were still struggling on forgotten street corners. Lydia sat at her cluttered desk, absent-mindedly tapping her pen against her notebook. Her mind refused to rest. She kept seeing Amber's wary eyes and Toby's thin shoulders hunched against the cold. Most of all, the article had awakened memories she had tucked away. Ethan Walker, the boy on Maple Street, the small corner of the world they had shared. Lydia had spent so many years wondering where he had gone. Did someone help him, the way she had tried? Or had the world turned its back on him too? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. "Carter?" It was Megan, one of her contacts from a local shelter. "I thought you might want to know there's something happening at the old Crescent shelter downtown. The one they almost shut down last year?" Lydia frowned. She remembered writing a small piece about the shelter's lack of funding. "What's going on?" "It's overrun. They're at double capacity, and the director says they're running out of supplies. Too many people, not enough help. I thought you might want to take a look." "I'll be there," Lydia said, already grabbing her jacket. The Crescent shelter sat in the heart of the old downtown district. Once a proud building with arched windows and intricate brickwork, it now stood tired and faded. The paint peeled around the edges of the door, and the sign above the entrance was rusted and cracked. Lydia's footsteps echoed loudly as she approached the shelter. Inside, the air felt close and heavy. Voices rose and fell, children crying, adults murmuring in exhaustion, volunteers shouting over the noise. The narrow hallway was lined with people sitting on the floor, their belongings packed into old bags and suitcases. Lydia's chest tightened as she took it all in. "Miss Carter?" A voice called her name, and she turned to see a woman approaching. Janice Morrison, the shelter's director, looked overwhelmed but determined, her hair pulled into a tight bun, and her sleeves rolled up as if she had been working non-stop. "Thank you for coming," Janice said, shaking Lydia's hand. "It's worse than you can imagine right now. We're out of space, out of food, out of everything, really." Lydia's eyes moved to a small group of children sitting quietly in the corner. One boy clutched a stuffed bear missing an arm, his eyes glazed with fatigue. A woman sat nearby, her face pale and drawn as she rocked a toddler on her lap. "How many people are staying here?" Lydia asked. "Over 100, Janice said, rubbing her temple. "We're meant to house half that number. Families are sleeping in hallways. People are hungry, and we're barely holding on." As they walked through the shelter, Janice introduced Lydia to several residents. Each story broke her heart a little more. A single mother who had lost her job, a teenage boy who had aged out of foster care and had nowhere to go, a grandmother caring for 3 grandchildren after their parents passed away. It felt overwhelming, the sheer weight of need. In the far corner of the shelter's small clinic area, Lydia noticed a group of people gathered around a man. He was tall, wearing a worn blue button-down shirt and a stethoscope draped around his neck. His voice was calm and steady as he spoke to a young girl sitting on the examination table. Lydia's curiosity stirred. "Who's that?" she asked Janice. "Oh, that's Dr. Ethan Walker," Janice replied. "He's been volunteering here for a year now, shows up every week to help whoever he can. I don't know what we'd do without him." The name hit Lydia like a thunderclap. She froze in place, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ethan Walker?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, he's been a godsend," Janice said, already moving on to the next hallway. Lydia stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot. Her thoughts tumbled over each other, disbelief clouding her mind. Could it really be him? Lydia found herself watching the doctor from a distance, her breath uneven. He moved with quiet efficiency, his hands steady as he cleaned a scrape on a little boy's knee. His voice was soft but firm, full of a gentleness Lydia recognized. It had been so many years, but as she looked closer, she began to see traces of the Ethan she had known, the way he tilted his head when he listened, the quiet focus in his expression, the boy she had given her sandwich to, the boy who had vanished without a trace. When Ethan finally looked up, his gaze caught hers. For a moment, the world seemed to still. Lydia's heart thundered in her chest as his brown eyes, those same brown eyes, locked onto hers. There was a flicker of recognition there, though it seemed buried deep. "Hi," Lydia said, her voice soft as she stepped forward. "You're Ethan Walker?" Ethan hesitated, as though searching for her face in the depths of his memory. "Yes," he replied cautiously. Lydia faltered, her voice catching. She could barely believe the words as she said them. "Do you remember me? I'm Lydia Carter." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, and the silence stretched between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan blinked, and a quiet smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Lydia," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "from Maple Street." Lydia's breath rushed out in relief, her emotions a tangled knot of joy and disbelief. "You remember?" "I do," he replied softly, looking at her with something like wonder. "It's been a long time." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to say so many things, to ask where he had been, what had happened, how he had come to this place. But the questions caught in her throat, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of this moment. Ethan seemed to sense it. He glanced around at the bustling shelter and then back at Lydia. "I'm not done here for the day," he said gently, "but I'd like to talk if you have time to wait." "I'll wait," Lydia said quickly, as though afraid the moment might slip away. Hours later, the shelter quieted down. Most of the residents had settled in for the night, and Lydia sat in a small room off the clinic as she waited for Ethan. Her notebook lay forgotten in her lap. Her hands shook slightly, her mind spinning. The door opened, and Ethan walked in, now without his stethoscope. He looked tired, but there was warmth in his expression. "You stayed," he said, sitting across from her. Lydia nodded, her voice hesitant. "I almost didn't believe it was you. I've wondered about you for so long. Where you went. What happened?" Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes distant. "It's a long story. Life took me places I didn't expect." He told her how, after his mother's death, he had been placed into the foster system, how he had moved from home to home, always feeling like he didn't belong. But he had never forgotten the girl who sat with him on Maple Street, the girl who had given him food, toys, and hope. "I told myself," Ethan said, "that I'd do something with my life, that I'd help people, the way you helped me." Lydia blinked back tears, her chest tight. "I didn't do much," she whispered. "You did enough," Ethan replied. "More than you'll ever know." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared past settling around them. Finally, Ethan smiled a small, genuine smile that lit up his tired face. "It's good to see you again, Lydia," he said softly. Lydia smiled back, her heart full. "It's good to see you too, Ethan." And for the first time in years, the ache she had carried with her began to ease. The sky was dark by the time Lydia Carter left the Crescent shelter. The streets were nearly empty, the air heavy with the faint hum of distant traffic. She walked slowly, her thoughts tangled with everything Ethan Walker had told her. She replayed their conversation over and over in her mind, the years he had spent drifting through the foster system, his struggles, his determination to build a better life. And through all of it, he had remembered her. Remembered the sandwiches, the toys, the small moments on that corner of Maple Street. Lydia's heart ached as she recalled his quiet words. "You did enough, more than you'll ever know." She had spent years wondering about Ethan, searching for an answer to his disappearance. And now, here he was, no longer the lost boy on the corner, but a man who had built himself into someone capable of helping others. Lydia was in awe of the strength it must have taken to get here. And yet, part of her still felt like that little girl who had sat on the sidewalk, watching a boy disappear without a goodbye. The next morning, Lydia sat at her desk in the newsroom, a fresh cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Her notebook lay open, filled with scribbled thoughts about the shelter, the people she had met, and, of course, Ethan. She wanted to write about him, about his journey, his resilience, and the invisible kindness that had set him on his path. But a part of her hesitated. Ethan had shared his story with her in confidence. Could she turn something so personal into an article? "Still brooding, Carter?" Mr. Wallace's gruff voice broke through her thoughts. He appeared beside her desk, arms crossed. "You're wasting daylight. What do you have on that shelter?" Lydia looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "There's more to the story," she said. "I'm not done yet." "More?" Wallace raised an eyebrow. "You've got the headline already. Overcrowded shelter, children in need. What else do you need?" "Hope," Lydia replied simply. "I need to show people hope." Mr. Wallace stared at her for a moment, as though trying to decide whether to argue. Then, with a grunt, he turned on his heel and walked away. Lydia knew she could not tell the story properly until she understood it better, and to do that, she needed to see Ethan again. Later that afternoon, Lydia found herself back at the Crescent shelter. She spotted Ethan near the clinic, helping an elderly man adjust his crutches. He looked up as she approached, his expression softening with recognition. "Lydia," he said with a small smile. "Back so soon?" "I hope you don't mind," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I wanted to talk more. About you." Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her. About me? Lydia nodded. I think your story matters, Ethan. People need to hear it. You've done so much how you got here. What you're doing now, it could inspire others. Ethan's smile faded a little, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, he said quietly. I didn't do anything special. I just kept going. Exactly, Lydia said softly. And sometimes that's the most special thing of all. For a long moment, Ethan was silent. He glanced around the shelter, watching the volunteers move among the residents. Finally, he spoke. Come with me. Lydia followed Ethan through the shelter and out the back door into a small courtyard. It was quiet here, the noise of the city muffled by high brick walls. A few patches of grass pushed up through cracks in the pavement, and an old wooden bench sat beneath a tree whose branches reached toward the sky. Ethan motioned for Lydia to sit, and she did. He sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as though trying to find the right words. When I was a kid, he began, his voice low, I used to think the world forgot about people like me, people who had nothing. I felt invisible. Lydia stayed quiet, letting him speak. But you saw me, Lydia. You sat with me when no one else did. You gave me food, toys, even books. Do you remember the picture book you gave me? Lydia's heart jumped. The one about the garden? Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. That book meant more to me than I could tell you. I used to read it over and over, imagining myself in that garden somewhere quiet and beautiful, where I could just belong. He paused, staring at the ground as memories swirled behind his eyes. When I ended up in foster care, I kept that book with me for years. It reminded me of you, of the kindness you showed me. And when things got hard, when I wanted to give up, I thought about that corner on Maple Street, about how you believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Lydia's chest tightened, and she blinked back tears. She had always wondered if her small gestures had mattered. Now, hearing Ethan's words, she knew they had. I wanted to make something of myself, Ethan continued, to prove that I could be more than what the world saw. I worked hard, got scholarships, went to college, and eventually, I became a doctor. He looked at Lydia then, his expression earnest. But none of it would have happened if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't given me hope. Lydia swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know I made that kind of difference. You did, Ethan said simply. The two sat in silence for a while, the air between them filled with the weight of shared memories. Lydia glanced at the tree in the courtyard, its leaves rustling softly in the breeze. I always wondered where you went, she said finally, her voice quiet. I waited for you for so long, and when you never came back, I thought maybe I hadn't helped you at all. Ethan's gaze softened. You did help me, Lydia, more than you'll ever know. Lydia nodded, a small, bittersweet smile on her face. For years, she had carried the ache of losing Ethan, not knowing what had become of him. Now, hearing his story, she felt that ache begin to heal. Why didn't you come back? She asked gently. Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. I wanted to, but when I went into foster care, everything changed so quickly. I didn't know how to find you again. Lydia nodded, understanding. But you made it. I did, Ethan replied. And now, I want to help others do the same. That evening, as Lydia sat at her kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her, she began to write. She wrote about Ethan, the boy she had met on the corner of Maple Street, the boy who had carried her kindness with him like a flame through the darkest parts of his life. She wrote about his struggles, his triumphs, and the way he had turned his pain into purpose. Her words poured onto the page with a quiet intensity, each sentence carrying the weight of everything they had shared. Lydia knew this story mattered. It was not just about Ethan. It was about hope, about how even the smallest act of kindness could change a life forever. When she finished, Lydia sat back and read the final line aloud. Sometimes, the smallest seeds of kindness grow into something we never could have imagined. All it takes is someone willing to plant them. She closed her notebook, her heart full. For the first time in years, Lydia felt like she had found an answer to the question that had lingered in her mind for so long. Ethan had made it. And in doing so, he had reminded her of something she had always believed, that kindness matters, that it can ripple outward, reaching places we may never see. And as Lydia sat there, she felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her small act of kindness had come full circle in the most unexpected of ways. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through Lydia Carter's apartment window, warming her cluttered desk where her notebook still lay open. She had barely slept. The words she had written about Ethan Walker lingered in her mind, their weight pulling at her heart like an invisible thread. Ethan's story wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. And Lydia felt that it deserved more than quiet pages in her notebook. It needed to be seen, to be heard. But a small voice in her head kept whispering doubts. What if he doesn't want his story shared? What if I overstep? She had promised herself she would respect Ethan's trust. So, before she did anything, she needed to talk to him. That afternoon, Lydia found herself walking through the familiar entrance of the Crescent shelter again. The building was buzzing with the low hum of life. Volunteers sorting supplies, children playing quietly in the corner, adults shuffling in and out of the clinic. Ethan Walker was there, as she knew he would be, standing in the clinic doorway with a clipboard in his hand. He looked up just as Lydia approached, his expression softening into a smile. Back again? He teased gently, setting the clipboard down. Lydia smiled faintly, feeling her nerves knot in her chest. I think you might be getting tired of seeing me. Not at all, Ethan replied, motioning for her to follow him. He led her outside to the quiet courtyard where they had spoken the day before. The afternoon sun made patterns of light and shadow through the branches of the tree, and the faint sounds of the shelter's activity felt distant here. They sat on the same bench. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he glanced at her curiously. You look like you have something on your mind. Lydia took a deep breath, steadying herself. I want to write your story, Ethan, about what you went through and what you're doing now. Ethan's expression shifted, surprise first, then something more guarded. Why? Because people need to hear it, Lydia said softly. They need to know that it's possible to come back from nothing. That kindness, even small kindness, matters. Ethan stared down at his hands for a long moment, silent. Lydia's heart thudded in her chest as she waited, afraid she had pushed too hard. Finally, Ethan looked up at her, his brown eyes thoughtful. I'm not sure I'm ready to be out there like that. I'm just one person. I don't want people thinking I'm special. Lydia shook her head firmly. You are special, Ethan, not because of what happened to you, but because of what you chose to do with it. You didn't let your past define you. You're helping people who are still fighting the battles you fought. That's worth sharing. Ethan's expression softened, though hesitation still flickered in his eyes. And what if people don't care? What if they just move on? Lydia smiled gently. That's the risk of telling a story. But if even one person reads it and feels seen or feels inspired to help someone else, then it's worth it. The quiet stretched between them as Ethan considered her words. He glanced at the tree overhead, its leaves swaying gently in the breeze. Finally, he exhaled and looked at Lydia with a faint, almost resigned smile. Okay, he said quietly. You can write it. Relief washed over Lydia, and she grinned. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. If you think it'll make a difference, then it's worth a try. Lydia reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook. "Thank you, Ethan. I promise I'll tell it right." Over the next week, Lydia spent hours with Ethan, both at the shelter and in quieter moments at a nearby coffee shop. She listened as he told her about the years after they had lost touch, how he had bounced from foster home to foster home, often feeling like a burden, always carrying that picture book she had given him. "When I got older," Ethan said one afternoon, his voice steady but distant, "I realized no one was coming to save me. If I wanted something better, I had to fight for it myself." He told her about the older couple who had finally taken him in when he was 16, how they had given him his first real home and encouraged him to stay in school. He spoke about late nights studying, about the weight of his exhaustion, and about the moment he had been accepted to college on a scholarship. "It was the first time I believed I could do something real," Ethan admitted, sipping his coffee. Lydia scribbled furiously, recording every detail. She marveled at Ethan's strength, how he had pushed through moments where others might have given up. "What about medicine?" she asked. "What made you want to become a doctor?" Ethan's smile was soft, almost wistful. "I guess I wanted to give back. I spent so much of my life feeling helpless. I wanted to be the person someone could count on in their hardest moments." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "And I remembered you, Lydia. You probably don't know this, but you were the first person who ever made me feel like I mattered." Lydia felt her throat tighten, the weight of his words settling into her heart. "You did matter, Ethan," she said softly. "You still do." As the article neared completion, Lydia felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. She wanted to do justice to Ethan's story, not just his struggles, but the quiet victories that had made him who he was. On the day she submitted the final draft, Lydia sat at her desk, staring at the headline on her computer screen. "From Forgotten to Found, How Kindness Saved a Life." She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar flicker of doubt. Would readers care? Would they see Ethan the way she did? But deep down, Lydia knew that the story needed to be told. She clicked send and leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. The article was published 3 days later. Lydia's editor, Mr. Wallace, had agreed to run it as a feature piece, giving it prime placement on the paper's website. By noon, the comments began to flood in. "This brought me to tears. Thank you for sharing his story. I never realized how small acts of kindness could have such an impact. We need more people like Ethan and like Lydia. How can I volunteer at the Crescent Shelter? Where can I donate?" Lydia read each comment with a mix of joy and relief. People were paying attention. Ethan's story was making a difference. Later that day, she received a text from Ethan. "I saw the article. Thank you. You told it perfectly." Lydia smiled, her chest swelling with pride. She felt, for the first time in a long while, that something had come full circle, that the small kindness she had shown all those years ago had grown into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. That evening, Lydia visited the Crescent Shelter to drop off supplies she had bought with some of the donations the article had inspired. Ethan was there, helping a young boy who had scraped his knee. "Busy day?" Lydia asked as she approached him. Ethan looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Busier than usual. We've had a lot of new volunteers since the article came out." "That's the idea," Lydia replied with a grin. Ethan stood and walked with her to the small courtyard outside. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the shelter's worn brick walls. "You did this," Ethan said quietly, looking at her. "You made people care." Lydia shook her head. "You did that, Ethan. I just helped them see you?" Ethan smiled, his expression soft. "It's funny," he said. "For so long, I thought kindness was just something you gave away, but it stays with you, doesn't it? Even after all this time." Lydia nodded, her heart full. "It does." The two of them sat on the bench beneath the tree, watching as the sky turned a deeper shade of blue. In that moment, Surrounded by the echoes of their shared past and the promise of something better, Lydia knew that their story was far from over. It was only just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity at the Crescent Shelter. Lydia's article had sparked something powerful. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and people who had never paid attention before began asking questions. The forgotten voices were finally being heard, and for the first time in a long while, the shelter felt alive with hope. Lydia Carter watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't pride that filled her, it was relief. Relief that the stories she had chosen to tell were making a difference. She felt like she had planted seeds, and now she could see them beginning to bloom. And at the center of it all was Ethan Walker. Ethan had always carried himself with a quiet determination, but since the article, something about him had changed. He moved with renewed purpose, a spark in his eyes as he worked with patients in the clinic or organized supplies with volunteers. Every time Lydia saw him, it struck her how far he had come from the lonely boy on the corner to the man who now held others up with steady, compassionate hands. One afternoon, Lydia arrived at the shelter with her notebook tucked under her arm. She hadn't planned to stay long, just long enough to check in on the shelter's progress, but as soon as she stepped through the door, she found herself swept into the hustle of the place. "Miss Lydia!" a small voice called out, and she turned to see Toby, the little boy she had first met weeks earlier, running toward her. His sister Amber followed behind him, a hesitant smile on her face. Lydia knelt to Toby's level, grinning. "Well, hello there. How are you?" "Better," Toby said brightly, holding up a small toy car someone had given him. "We're not staying at the train station anymore." Amber, now standing beside him, nodded. "We've been here for a while, and the people are nice. Dr. Walker helped us a lot." Lydia's heart warmed as she glanced across the room. Ethan stood near the clinic, talking to a new volunteer. He looked up just then, as if sensing her gaze, and offered her a small, familiar smile. Amber tugged at Lydia's sleeve. "He said you're the one who wrote the article that got us help. Is that true?" Lydia felt a mix of humility and gratitude. "I wrote about what people needed to hear, but Ethan's the one who's here every day, making sure people like you have a place to go." Amber looked thoughtful, her tough exterior softening. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing us." The simple words struck Lydia deep in her chest. She watched as Amber guided Toby toward a table where other children were playing, and for a moment, she let herself feel the weight of what they had accomplished. "You're a magnet for the kids," Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. Lydia turned to find him standing beside her, hands in his pockets, his smile easy. "They like you," he added. "They like you more," Lydia teased, glancing at him. Ethan chuckled softly. "Kids are honest. They know who's there for them." He looked out at the shelter, his eyes softening. "I'm glad you came today. It's been busy." Lydia tucked her notebook under her arm. "I wasn't planning to stay long, but it's hard to leave when you see how much good is happening here." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a good kind of busy, a little overwhelming, but good." He paused, glancing at her. "You're part of that, you know. Your article, it did more than just raises money. It reminded people to care." Lydia shifted slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think you give me too much credit, Ethan. You're the one who's here, day after day." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "We make a good team, though, don't we?" The words were simple, but they lingered in the space between them. Lydia smiled softly. "Yeah," she said, "I think we do." Over the next few weeks, Lydia began spending more time at the shelter. It started with follow-ups for her story, checking on the new volunteers, tracking how donations were being used, but gradually it became something more. She found herself drawn to the place. It wasn't just about the article anymore, it was about the people. She spent afternoons helping in the kitchen, laughing with the kids, and organizing donations. She watched Ethan as he worked tirelessly in the clinic, treating scrapes and colds, listening to the quiet worries of the residents with a patience that seemed endless. And through it all, Lydia and Ethan grew closer. One Friday evening, Lydia arrived at the shelter later than usual. The main hall was quieter now, the residents settling in for the night. She found Ethan alone in the clinic, reorganizing the shelves of medical supplies. "You're still here?" she asked, leaning against the door frame. Ethan glanced back at her with a tired smile. "You're still here too." Lydia shrugged, stepping into the room. "I was on my way out, but I thought I'd say goodnight." Ethan nodded, setting a box of bandages down on the counter. "It's been a long day." Lydia leaned on the edge of the desk, watching him. "You work too much, you know that?" Ethan laughed softly. "Takes one to know one." They shared a quiet moment of understanding, the kind that comes from two people who know what it means to pour themselves into something bigger than themselves. Ethan sat down in one of the chairs, his shoulders visibly slumping with fatigue. Lydia watched him for a moment before speaking. "Why do you do this, Ethan? I mean, every single day. It must get exhausting." Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible," he said simply. "And I don't want anyone else to feel that way." His words hung in the air, raw and honest. Lydia felt a lump rise in her throat. "You really are something else, Ethan Walker." He smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you, Lydia Carter." Lydia looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. "You know, sometimes I think I found you again for a reason," she said softly. "Like the universe decided we had unfinished business." Ethan's expression turned thoughtful. "Maybe we did, or maybe it was just meant to be." Lydia glanced up at him then, meeting his eyes. There was something unspoken in the way they looked at each other, an understanding that went deeper than words. "You've come a long way," she said quietly. "So, have you?" Ethan replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clinic was still and quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. Finally, Lydia stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "You should go home, Ethan. Get some rest." Ethan smiled as he stood, stretching his arms. "I'll head out soon. Thanks for checking on me." Lydia paused at the doorway, turning back to him. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Lydia." As she walked through the empty shelter, Lydia felt a warmth in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just about the shelter or the story, or even the work they were doing together. It was about Ethan. Somehow, over the weeks they had spent rebuilding bridges to the past, Lydia realized she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A friend, a partner, someone who understood her because he had lived his own version of the same story. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, Lydia smiled to herself, feeling for the first time in years that everything was starting to fall into place. The leaves had started to change color, dotting the streets with shades of gold and rust. Lydia Carter pulled her jacket tighter around her as she walked to the Crescent shelter. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing, but her mind buzzed with thoughts she hadn't yet untangled. Over the past few weeks, her bond with Ethan Walker had deepened. Their conversations no longer stayed on the surface. They often talked late into the evening about the shelter, about their lives, about the invisible struggles they saw each day. With each passing day, Lydia grew more certain of something she hadn't dared to admit before. She felt at home when she was with him. The thought startled her sometimes, like she'd stumbled upon a fragile truth. She wasn't ready to speak out loud, but it was there, undeniable and growing, just like the connection they had rebuilt. When Lydia entered the shelter that afternoon, the warm hum of voices greeted her. Volunteers were busy sorting supplies, and children played near a small corner of the main hall where someone had set up a table for coloring. She spotted Ethan near the clinic, crouched beside a young boy, helping him tie his shoes. The boy grinned as Ethan patted his shoulder and sent him on his way. Ethan stood then, his eyes catching Lydia's across the room. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "You're back," he said as she approached. Lydia smiled, shrugging off her jacket. "I couldn't stay away. It's becoming a habit." Ethan chuckled. "There are worse habits." "True," she replied. "Have a minute? I brought you something." Ethan looked surprised but nodded, motioning for her to follow him. They walked together to the courtyard, where the tree's leaves had begun to drift down, littering the ground in vibrant shades. Lydia pulled a small bag from her tote, handing it to him. "Here, I thought of you when I saw it." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but opened the bag. Inside was a picture book, the same one Lydia had given him years ago, or at least a newer edition of it. The cover showed a garden bursting with flowers, a little boy standing in the middle with a look of wonder on his face. For a moment, Ethan was still. He stared at the book, his fingers tracing the cover. When he looked up at Lydia, his eyes were soft, filled with something she couldn't quite name. "You remembered," he said quietly. "Of course I did," Lydia replied with a small smile. "You told me how much it meant to you." Ethan glanced back at the book, his expression distant but tender. "I used to read this every night. Even when I was in foster homes, I kept it with me. It reminded me of what you said, that maybe I could have my own garden someday." Lydia sat down on the bench, gesturing for him to join her. "And now?" she asked softly. "Do you still think about that garden?" Ethan let out a breath, sitting beside her. He held the book in his hands, turning it over carefully, as though it might disappear if he wasn't gentle. "I do," he admitted. "Only now the garden looks different. It's not a place anymore. It's the work we're doing here, the people we're helping." He paused, glancing at her. "It's the people who remind me that something good can still grow, even in the hardest places." Lydia felt her chest tighten. There was so much truth in Ethan's words, so much honesty. "That's beautiful," she said softly. Ethan smiled faintly, his gaze dropping to the book again. "It's funny, isn't it? How the smallest things can leave the biggest mark. I don't think you realized, back then, what you were doing for me." Lydia swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "I didn't," she admitted. "I just knew you looked like you needed a friend. And I guess, so did I." Ethan looked at her then, his brown eyes steady and kind. "You were my friend. You still are." The words settled around them, soft but significant. Lydia looked away, watching the leaves drift lazily from the branches above. She felt the warmth of Ethan's presence beside her, solid and real. "Do you ever think about going back?" Ethan asked suddenly. Lydia frowned slightly, turning to look at him. "Back where?" "To Maple Street," Ethan replied. "Where it all started." Lydia blinked, startled by the suggestion. She hadn't thought about that corner in years, not in the way he meant. "Why?" Ethan shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "I guess I just think maybe it's time to see it again, to remind ourselves how far we've come." The idea sat in Lydia's chest like a quiet hum. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's go back." The next morning, Lydia picked Ethan up in her small car, the windows slightly fogged from the cool autumn air. The drive to her childhood neighborhood was filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. Ethan watched the world pass by outside the window, as though searching for something he hadn't yet put into words. When they turned onto Maple Street, Lydia felt her pulse quicken. Everything looked the same. The rows of tidy houses, the trees lining the sidewalks, the familiar corner where her life had changed in ways she couldn't have understood then. She parked the car, and they sat there for a moment, neither of them speaking. "This is it," Lydia said quietly. Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the stop sign. "It's smaller than I remember." Lydia smiled faintly. "Me too." They climbed out of the car and walked toward the corner together. The cracked sidewalk was still there, though the stop signs now looked shinier, as if someone had replaced it. A small gust of wind rustled the leaves, and Lydia felt the past press gently against her shoulders. "This was where you sat," she said, pointing to the edge of the sidewalk. Ethan crouched down, brushing his fingers lightly over the spot. "And this was where you stood, holding that sandwich." Lydia laughed softly, though her voice caught in her throat. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "It does," Ethan murmured. He stood then, looking at her with an expression so full of emotion that Lydia felt her chest ache. "But I still remember it, like it was yesterday." They stood together in silence, the weight of memory settling around them. Lydia thought of the little girl she had been, the girl who had approached a lonely boy with nothing more than a sandwich and a shy smile. She thought of how that single act had rippled outward, shaping both their lives in ways she could never have imagined. "It's strange," Lydia said finally, her voice quiet. "I always thought I lost something when you disappeared, but now I think maybe I found something too." Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. "You gave me hope, Lydia, and because of that, I got to build something I never thought I'd have." Lydia felt her heart swell, the words hitting her with a quiet power. "You gave me hope too," she admitted. "You reminded me that the little things matter, that even the smallest act of kindness can change everything." Ethan smiled then, a smile that seemed to reach deep into the corners of his soul. "I guess we saved each other." Lydia smiled back, blinking against the sting of tears. "Yeah, I guess we did." They stood there for a long while, side by side, as the world moved quietly around them. The corner of Maple Street, once just a forgotten spot on the sidewalk, now felt sacred proof that something beautiful could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice soft but certain. "Let's keep going, Lydia. Let's keep doing this, helping people, telling their stories. Together." Lydia looked at him, her chest warm with something she couldn't quite name. "Together," she echoed. And as they walked back to the car, Lydia felt something shift inside her. It was as though a piece of her past had finally fallen into place, allowing her to see the path ahead more clearly. The journey that had begun with a single act of kindness all those years ago was far from over. And for the first time in a long while, Lydia knew she wasn't walking it alone. The visit to Maple Street stayed with Lydia Carter long after she and Ethan Walker had driven away. It felt as though they had picked up a thread from the past, a thread that connected who they had been to who they had become. That corner, once just a forgotten patch of sidewalk, had turned into something sacred, a reminder of how one small act of kindness could ripple outward and shape lives. But now, standing in the shelter clinic a week later, Lydia realized how much further the ripples had spread. The Crescent shelter buzzed with activity, busier than Lydia had ever seen it. Volunteers worked in the kitchen preparing meals, others sorted clothes in the donation room, and Ethan moved between clinic patients with his usual quiet focus. It was as if a renewed energy had breathed life into the place. The effects of Lydia's article, combined with Ethan's work, had brought real change. Donations had increased, new programs had started, and families who had once been invisible were beginning to feel seen. "Here's the last box," a volunteer called out, placing a crate of canned goods on the floor. Lydia, crouched beside a stack of boxes, stood and stretched her back with a groan. "You sure this is a good use of your time?" Ethan teased as he appeared beside her, holding a clipboard. "You're usually better at words than lifting things." Lydia shot him a mock glare. "I'm capable of multitasking, thank you very much." Ethan grinned, the teasing light in his eyes softening as he glanced around the room. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen this place so alive. It feels different." Lydia followed his gaze, watching as volunteers and residents worked side by side. A group of kids sat in the corner drawing pictures with crayons, their laughter echoing through the hall. Nearby, a teenager helped an elderly man sort through donated coats, offering him a kind smile as he held up a jacket. "It's because people finally care," Lydia said softly. "Your work made them care, Ethan. You're the heart of this place." Ethan looked at her then, something unspoken passing between them. "We did this together," he replied quietly. The words warmed Lydia's chest, settling deep within her. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Lydia sat in the shelter's small break room, sharing coffee from mismatched mugs. The room was quiet, a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the day. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I was talking to Janice earlier," he said, referring to the shelter's director. "She mentioned an idea to start a new health program here. Something permanent? Free clinics? Counseling? Maybe even some educational workshops for the kids?" Lydia raised her eyebrows, intrigued. "That sounds incredible. What's holding it back?" "Funding," Ethan said simply, setting his mug down. "The donations we've gotten have been great, but something like this would need more stability. It's not just a one-time fix, it's building something that lasts." Lydia nodded, a familiar determination stirring inside her. "Then let's do it. Let's find the funding." Ethan looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Lydia replied. "People will help if they know the story. That's where I come in." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't stop, do you?" "Not when it matters," Lydia said firmly. "And this matter, Ethan? The work you're doing here, it's changing lives. People need to see that." For a moment, Ethan was silent, his gaze fixed on her, as though he were seeing something he hadn't noticed before. "You know," he said softly, "I don't think I've ever met anyone as determined as you." Lydia felt her cheeks flush, but she smiled. It helps to have someone equally determined to team up with. Ethan's smile widened, a rare, genuine expression that lit up his face. Over the next few weeks, Lydia and Ethan threw themselves into the project. Lydia worked tirelessly, pitching the story to potential sponsors, charities, and local organizations. She wrote feature pieces about the shelter's residents' stories of families rebuilding, children finding safety, and volunteers who had come together to create a sense of community. Ethan, meanwhile, organized the logistics of the health program. He met with local doctors and nurses willing to volunteer their time and mapped out how the clinics could operate on a regular schedule. Together, they made a formidable team, two people driven by the same quiet fire, determined to create something that would outlast them both. One evening, Lydia sat in her apartment, surrounded by scattered papers and notes. She had just finished a proposal for the shelter's funding pitch and leaned back in her chair with a sigh. She glanced at her phone and noticed a text from Ethan. "Ethan, can you meet me at the shelter courtyard? I want to show you something." Lydia smiled to herself, grabbing her coat and keys before heading out. The courtyard at the shelter was quiet when Lydia arrived, the evening sky painted in hues of deep blue and orange. Ethan stood near the tree, holding a small watering can. A handful of kids clustered around him, watching intently as he bent down and poured water over the freshly turned soil. "What's going on here?" Lydia asked, stepping closer. Ethan straightened, brushing the dirt from his hands. "We're planting a garden." Lydia's breath caught. "A garden?" Ethan nodded, his eyes warm. "Some of the kids came up with the idea. They said they wanted to plant something beautiful, something that could grow here, where it's needed." Lydia knelt beside the small plot of dirt. Tiny flowers were already starting to sprout, their delicate green shoots pushing through the soil. A small handmade sign sat at the edge of the garden. It read, "The Hope Garden." "It's perfect," Lydia said softly, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Ethan crouched beside her, glancing at the kids as they worked, their hands covered in dirt, and their laughter filling the courtyard. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think having a garden was just a dream, but I realize now it's more than that. It's a symbol. Lydia turned to look at him, her heart full. A symbol of what? Of what happens when people care, Ethan replied. When they believe that something good can come from even the hardest places. Lydia swallowed hard, overcome by the weight of his words. She looked back at the small garden, feeling its meaning settle deep within her. This is just the beginning, Ethan said, his voice steady. The health program, the shelter, this garden, it's all connected. It's about showing people that hope is still possible. Lydia met his gaze, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to still. She saw in Ethan's eyes the same determination she carried within herself, the same belief that they could make a difference, no matter how small. You've built something beautiful here, Ethan, she said softly. We've built it, Ethan corrected, his expression warm. They sat together beside the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the courtyard in soft shadows. The children chattered nearby, their laughter a gentle reminder of everything they were fighting for. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Lydia realized something profound. She and Ethan weren't just helping people, they were healing themselves too. The boy she had met on Maple Street, who had once sat alone and hopeless, had grown into a man who gave others a reason to believe in something better. And Lydia, who had once felt the ache of losing him, had rediscovered not only her purpose, but also the power of connection. The garden, small and fragile though it was, felt like a promise. A promise that no matter how hard life might seem, something beautiful could always grow. The Hope Garden flourished quietly in the Crescent Shelter's courtyard over the next few weeks. Each morning, Ethan Walker would stop to water the fragile plants, often joined by the children who had first dreamed it into existence. Their small hands eagerly pulled weeds and arranged stones around the edges, as though protecting something precious. To Lydia Carter, the garden had come to symbolize far more than a patch of flowers. It was proof of how far they had come, how far Ethan had come. From the boy sitting alone on Maple Street to the man who had built hope from hardship, Ethan's life now touched countless others, and she had been lucky enough to see it happen. But Lydia knew their work wasn't done. Late one afternoon, Lydia sat across from Janice Morrison, the shelter's director, in the small, crowded office just off the main hall. Piles of paperwork and binders covered Janice's desk, and a chipped coffee mug balanced precariously near the edge. "I can't thank you both enough," Janice said, shaking her head with a smile. "The health program is finally happening. I just got confirmation that our grant application was approved." Lydia's eyes lit up. "That's incredible news." "All thanks to the attention you and Ethan brought," Janice continued. "Your article, it didn't just tell people about the problem, it made them care." Lydia's chest swelled with pride, but her thoughts turned immediately to Ethan. He had always been reluctant to take credit, but she knew how hard he had worked for this. "Where is he?" Janice asked, noticing Lydia glancing around the room. Lydia smiled softly. "Probably in the courtyard with the kids." Janice chuckled. "Of course he is." Lydia grabbed her notebook and stood. "I think I'll go tell him the good news." The sun hung low in the sky when Lydia stepped outside. The courtyard was quiet, except for the soft hum of the wind and the faint laughter of children somewhere in the distance. Ethan sat on the bench beneath the tree, his back to her, a watering can resting at his feet. He looked up when Lydia approached, his face breaking into a gentle smile. "You found me." "You're easy to find these days," Lydia teased as she sat beside him. "I bring news." "Oh?" She grinned. "The shelter's health program has been approved. Janice got the grant." Ethan's expression stilled for a moment, as though he were processing the words. Then a smile spread slowly across his face, one of genuine relief and pride. "That's incredible," he said quietly. "You made it happen," Lydia replied. "This was your vision, Ethan. You built it." Ethan shook his head slightly. "I didn't do it alone." Lydia looked at him, her smile soft. "No, but you led the way." He turned his gaze toward the garden, where the fragile plants swayed gently in the breeze. "It's funny," he said, his voice low, "how something can start so small. You plant a seed, not knowing if it'll take root, and then, one day, it's just there." Lydia followed his gaze, the quiet symbolism not lost on her. "Do you think you'll ever stop planting seeds?" she asked. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes warm. "Not as long as I have something to give." Lydia's chest tightened. There was something about Ethan's quiet resolve that made her feel steady, like he was the grounding force she hadn't realized she needed. She watched him for a moment, the sunlight catching the edges of his face, and felt the same warmth she always did when he was near. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about everything that's happened, everything we've done here." Ethan turned to look at her, waiting. "I think this was always supposed to happen," Lydia continued, "that you and I were supposed to find each other again." Ethan's eyes softened. "You believe in that kind of thing? Destiny?" "I don't know," Lydia admitted, "but I do believe in second chances, and I think maybe this was ours." Ethan's gaze held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Maybe it was. The days turned into weeks, and as the health program began to take shape, Lydia and Ethan found themselves busier than ever. Lydia wrote articles highlighting the shelter's progress, sharing stories of families who had been helped and lives that had been changed. Each story felt like another piece of the puzzle, a way to show the world that hope was real and tangible. Meanwhile, Ethan worked tirelessly to organize the clinic. Local doctors and nurses volunteered their time, and the shelter buzzed with the energy of something new and hopeful. Families now had access to care they couldn't have dreamed of before, and children who had once seemed so fragile were now running through the halls with laughter on their lips. It felt like the world was shifting slowly, but surely. One quiet afternoon, Lydia found herself back in the courtyard, sitting beside the small hope garden. She traced her fingers over the soil, marveling at how much the plants had grown. "Lost in thought?" Ethan's voice broke the silence, and she looked up to see him walking toward her, a faint smile on his face. "Just reflecting," Lydia replied. "It feels like things are finally settling into place." Ethan sat beside her on the bench, glancing at the garden. "You've done a lot, Lydia. More than you realize." Lydia shook her head. "It's not just me. It's all of us. You, Janice, the volunteers, the kids." She paused, looking at him. "We've built something real here, haven't we?" Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, we have." They sat together in comfortable silence, the sun warm on their faces. Lydia glanced sideways at Ethan, the familiar weight of unspoken words lingering on her tongue. "Ethan?" she said quietly. He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Yeah? I'm proud of you," she said simply. Ethan blinked, his expression softening. For a moment, he looked like he was going to say something, but then he smiled a smile so genuine it seemed to light up his entire face. "I'm proud of you too, Lydia," he replied. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lydia felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of peace, of gratitude. She realized then that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not just answers, but connection, a place to belong. A week later, the shelter held a small celebration to mark the official opening of the new health program. Residents, volunteers, and donors gathered in the main hall, the energy in the room electric with hope. Ethan stood at the front, his voice steady as he thanked everyone who had made it possible. Lydia watched from the crowd, her heart swelling with pride as she listened to him speak. "None of this would have happened without people who believed in something bigger than themselves," Ethan said. His eyes found Lydia's in the crowd, and he smiled. "It starts with kindness, Small moments that seem insignificant, but ripple outward in ways we can't imagine. I know that because it happened to me. Lydia felt tears prick at her eyes, her chest tight with emotion. As the crowd applauded, Ethan stepped down and made his way to Lydia's side. "You did it," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it," Ethan corrected, his smile warm. Lydia looked at him for a long moment, 1,000 words she couldn't say lingering on her tongue. Finally, she settled for the simplest truth. "I'm glad we found each other again." Ethan's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Me too, Lydia. Me too." That evening, as they stood together in the shelter courtyard beneath the quiet sky, Lydia glanced at the Hope Garden one last time. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant and alive. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ethan said softly. Lydia nodded. "It's more than beautiful. It's proof." "Proof of what?" "That even the smallest seeds can grow into something extraordinary," she replied. Ethan smiled, his eyes warm. "I think you were right, Lydia, about second chances, about us." Lydia smiled back, her heart full. Maybe this is just the beginning. And as they stood there, side by side, Lydia knew that the journey they had started all those years ago on a quiet corner of Maple Street had come full circle. The seeds they had planted had grown, and together they would keep planting more. Years later, the Crescent Shelter stood as a beacon of hope in the city, far more than anyone could have imagined when it first struggled to survive. Its walls echoed with laughter, stories of resilience, and the quiet hum of lives being rebuilt. The health program Ethan Walker had envisioned had expanded to include workshops, counseling services, and education for children who deserved a future beyond the streets. The Hope Garden, now lush and vibrant, had grown far beyond its small patch of dirt. Flowers of every color bloomed, their roots deep and strong proof that something beautiful could always grow from the most unlikely places. Lydia Carter stood beside Ethan near the garden one quiet afternoon, their shoulders brushing lightly as they watched the children run between the flowers, their laughter carried on the breeze. "Look how far it's come," Lydia murmured, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Ethan nodded, his eyes soft with pride. "It started with kindness, and look what it became." Lydia turned to him, smiling. "Sometimes the smallest acts leave the biggest marks." Ethan looked at her then, his expression full of gratitude. "And sometimes those marks change everything." Together, they walked toward the shelter's entrance, ready to keep going, to keep helping, to keep planting seeds of hope in places where others saw nothing but loss. Lydia and Ethan's story reminds us all that kindness matters. Even the smallest gesture, a sandwich, a shared dream, a listening ear, can change a life in ways we may never see. Like seeds planted in fertile soil, those moments of compassion take root and grow into something extraordinary. If this story touched your heart, consider the power you hold to make a difference. Every small act of kindness counts, and together we can change the world one person, one moment, and one story at a time. If you enjoyed this story and its message of hope and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's continue planting seeds of kindness because you never know how far they will grow.